Before Al Capone, before Lucky Luciano, before organised crime even had a name, there was Arnold Rothstein. Lucky, Bugsy, Meyer, Frank, Dutch, some of the most recognisable names in mob history. Between them, they built empires, sparked wars, and even ordered each other's deaths. But they all had one thing in common. They were all mentored by the man who laid the very foundation of the mob itself, Arnold Rothstein. He was the first to see prohibition not as a restriction, but as a business opportunity. And with the fortune made from illegal liquor, he transformed crime from a chaotic street hustle into a disciplined corporate machine. No one in the underworld had more rackets. He fixed World Series baseball games. He was the largest importer of both booze and opium in the United States. He won millions at the poker tables. He had the winner of every horse race locked in before the horses had even left the gate. He controlled the garment industry, the boxing world, stole and sold Liberty bonds and ran casinos across New York and New Jersey. During the Roaring Twenties, Arnold Rothstein was more than just rich. He was the undisputed king of the American underworld. He had many names: AR, Mr. Big, The Fixer, The Big Bankroll, The Man Uptown, and Mr. Broadway, but most knew him simply as The Brain. He inspired the character of Meyer Wolfsheim in The Great Gatsby, and he was the hidden hand behind the infamous Black Sox scandal. And perhaps his power was never clearer than in 1915, when 8 NYPD officers raided a game that Rothstein was sitting in. He shot 3 of the officers in front of 30 witnesses and walked away scot-free. At the trial, all 8 cops claimed that they couldn't remember who pulled the trigger. By the early 1920s, Arnold Rothstein wasn't just a gambler. He literally was Mr. New York City. This is the story of Arnold Rothstein, the man who built the mob. Arnold Rothstein was born in Manhattan on January the 17th, 1882. His father, Abraham, was a deeply religious man, holding tightly to his Orthodox Jewish faith at a time when many Americans, including many Jewish immigrants, were drifting away from tradition. On September the 3rd, 1879, 3 years before Arnold's birth, Abraham entered into an arranged marriage with Esther Rothschild, a 17-year-old from San Francisco. As was typical at the time within Orthodox Jewish communities, the couple had never met before their wedding day. Abraham travelled across the country from New York to California and met his bride for the first time ever just hours before the ceremony. They eventually settled into a home on East 47th Street, where Arnold, their second son, was born, followed by 5 more children in the years to come. The Rothsteins were very comfortable for the time. Abraham was a respected businessman who made his fortune in the cotton trade. Known for his honesty, generosity, and unwavering principles, he built a reputation not just for success, but for integrity. He donated regularly to local Jewish causes and served as chairman of the board at Beth Israel Hospital, which, at the time, was a towering 16-story, 500-bed facility and the tallest hospital building in the world. His wealth and civic standing placed the family firmly in the upper tier of New York's Jewish community. When the cotton market collapsed in the aftermath of World War I, many of his business associates filed for bankruptcy to escape their debts, but Abraham refused. Even while staring down financial ruin, he chose to pay what he owned, declining to take advantage of the bankruptcy laws and further cementing the nickname that followed him for life, Abe the Just. Despite their comfortable life, the bond between Arnold and his older brother Harry was fractured from the start. When Arnold was just 3 years old, his father found him standing over a sleeping Harry, clutching a knife and repeatedly muttering, "I hate Harry." It really was the first unsettling glimpse of a darker side to Arnold, one driven by jealousy, resentment, and a need to be noticed. A few years later, Arnold was found by Abe crying uncontrollably in a closet at home, telling his father that he felt unloved and that everybody hated him and he'd never be as good as Harry. Abe realised then that Arnold craved to be the centre of attention and became frustrated when he was not. Arnold would later tell a newspaper that this was the most emotional moment of his childhood and the only time he ever cried in his life. As the boys grew older, Harry became everything Abraham had hoped for. The boys attended the East Side Hebrew Institute on East 8th Street in Manhattan, and Harry excelled. He topped his classes, mastered Yiddish, and by the age of 13, proudly announced that he wanted to become a rabbi. Arnold, on the other hand, hated school. He saw teachers as enemies and homework as a pointless chore. He was so disinterested that he was held back 2 years and ended up in the same 5th grade class as his younger brother, Edgar, who often completed Arnold's homework for him. But there was one subject where Arnold needed no help at all: mathematics. Arnold was a natural, a genius with numbers. His mental arithmetic was far beyond his years, and, without question, he was the best at maths in the school. For the first time, Arnold began to attract some of the attention that had always gone to Harry, but while his brother studied prayers and prepared for a different life of faith, Arnold's interests were drifting toward a very different world indeed. He turned his attention to the Lower East Side, the same crowded slum where his father had grown up, now drowning in crime, corruption, and violence. Petty theft, street prostitution, and gang warfare were woven into the fabric of daily life. The old Irish outfits like the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys had given way to a new, far more ruthless generation of Jewish gangsters. Men like Monk Eastman and his brutal lieutenants, Kid Dropper Kaplan and Big Jack Zelig, now ruled the streets. They were muscle for hire, enforcers who worked for the city's most powerful pimps, politicians, and gamblers. For a few dollars, Jack Zelig would slash a man's face with a knife. For 100, Kid Dropper would kill without hesitation. Then there was the Yiddish Black Hand, a group that terrorized its own community. Led by Jacob Levinsky, they sent threatening letters to Jewish shopkeepers and merchants, demanding payments under the threat of arson, or worse. By the turn of the century, Monk Eastman's crew in the Yiddish Black Hand divided the Lower East Side into a criminal empire built on violence and fear. And it was in this world, far from his father's uptown respectability, education, and religious discipline, that Arnold Rothstein found his true calling, the intoxicating thrill of the gamble. In 1894, the New York State Constitution formally banned all gambling except horse racing, which wasn't exactly good news for 12-year-old Arnold. But banning it didn't mean stopping it. If anything, gambling became more widespread than ever. You could place a bet just about anywhere, in the back rooms of bars, inside uptown parlours, dressed up in velvet and crystal, or crammed into smoky tenement apartments downtown. Outlawing gambling only seemed to make it more popular, as these things tend to go. As the 20th century began, the NYPD was quietly collecting over $3 million a year in bribes, more than $75 million in today's money, and they were more than happy to look the other way, while men like Herman Rosenthal, Harry Vallon, and bald Jack Rose operated gambling houses under the protection of crooked politicians. This was the world Arnold Rothstein was desperate to be a part of, and he stood in direct opposition to everything his father believed in. Every Friday night, as Abraham placed his gold watch neatly on the dresser before leaving for the synagogue, Arnold would wait. As soon as the door closed, he'd pawn the watch for a quick 30 or 40 bucks, enough to bankroll a night of gambling, or to lend out at crushing interest rates to players down on their luck. Before his father returned, he'd rush to buy it back. The risk wasn't just worth it, it was the point. It gave him a thrill, a taste of control, and the chance to turn somebody else's desperation into profit. His education in gambling began at a house run by Herman Rosenthal, tucked into the corner of Orchard and Rivington Streets. Arnold was too young to get through the door, so he lingered outside, slipping a few coins to older men to place bets on the horse racing on his behalf, and passed the time by playing cards with other boys outside on the stoop. It was around this time that he adopted a personal rule, one he would carry for the rest of his life: never play a game you aren't certain you can beat. On one occasion, Arnold actually managed to slip inside the gambling house. The moment he entered, he was transfixed. Horse racing results crackled over the radio. Gaslight chandeliers flickered above thick clouds of cigar smoke. He peered through the haze, trying to catch a glimpse of the cards, coins and dice on the tables. Around them sat a strange brotherhood of corrupt cops, working class gamblers and crooked politicians, all speaking a language he already understood. It was a world completely unlike the poverty-stricken streets outside, and from that moment, he was hooked. After finally dropping out of school, Arnold took a job as a travelling salesman for his father's cotton company, a job which he had quite literally no passion for, but it offered something more valuable than a paycheck: the freedom to move city to city, and more importantly, the opportunity to gamble. For the next few years, Rothstein made sales by day and played cards by night, often going without sleep as he stayed at the tables from dusk until dawn. He had some significant wins on the tables in Boston and Detroit, aided by his natural genius with numbers, but in 1899, during a trip to Chicago, his luck turned. A high-stakes poker game wiped him out, including money his father had given him to support his work. Too ashamed to return home, Arnold rented a small room at the Broadway Central Hotel at 673 Broadway and began selling cigars to get by. As it turned out, it was a fortunate move. Cigar shops were a haven for gamblers, places where bookies, card sharks and hustlers came to relax, talk odds, and place quiet bets. Rothstein began mingling with some of the city's biggest players, listening more than he spoke and slowly learning how to spot a bad bet, a rigged game, or a crooked house. With time, winning became less a matter of luck and more a matter of pattern. It became a habit. He started carrying a thick roll of cash, not just to gamble with, but to lend out, always at 20% interest and always due by the following Monday. And around this time, he earned the first nickname of many, the Big Bankroll. He also gained a reputation for his peculiar side bets at the tables. He'd pull out a $50 bill and propose a poker-style game based on serial numbers. If his note read D7981376 he had 3 sevens. If his opponent's read R7546484 they had 2 4s and 2 8s. And since 3 of a kind beat 2 pair, Rothstein would win. What most people didn't realise was that he had memorised dozens of serial numbers in advance, carefully selected, folded into his pocket, and ready for the right moment. It was just another quiet way that Rothstein tilted the odds in his favour. By 1908, at the age of 26, Rothstein was living at the Hotel Metropole at 147 West 43rd Street, just a stone's throw from Times Square. He became a fixture in the hotel's lobby, which had, by then, earned a reputation as a gathering place for the city's most serious gamblers and gangsters. Rothstein was already known for fixing games, often by paying off the dealer, rigging the deck, or, when necessary, literally hiding cards up his sleeve. He was smug in victory and made a habit of rubbing it in. Despite the company he kept, Rothstein didn't look like a crook. He was slim, sharply dressed, and always composed. His dark, intense eyes gave the impression that he could read a man before a word was even spoken. But as his reputation grew, so did his arrogance. He became known for his cutting remarks and for his cruel habit of making people wait, sometimes for weeks, for money he owed them, despite him having it. Another of his usual haunts was Jack's Oyster Bar, just down the block at West 43rd and 6th Avenue. Jack's was far too busy and far too visible for even the paid-off NYPD to ignore card games, but it did have a pool table, and Rothstein loved pool, not just for the game itself, but for the crowd that bet on it. And once again, he found a way to cheat. Rothstein paid the owner of Jack's, Jack Durnston, to quietly swap out the cue ball before he arrived, replacing it one that was subtly off-weighted or coated to roll just differently enough to throw off his opponent. Meanwhile, back in his suite at the Metropole, Rothstein had spent all week practicing with the altered cue ball, and by the time that the match began, he had every angle worked out. His opponents, unaware of his trick, struggled with shots that they would usually make, and Rothstein walked away the winner. But eventually, the regulars at Jack's and the Metropole began to catch on. No one could be that lucky that often, not without help. Word spread, and by late 1908, a group of local toughs and gamblers decided it was time to teach the smug young man a lesson. Among them were the notorious conman Wilson Misner, who clearly didn't like the taste of his own medicine, and two well-known newspaper cartoonists, Hype Igo and Tad Dorgan. The same Tad Dorgan who would later give the English language phrases like the cat's pajamas and for crying out loud. They knew that Rothstein's pride was his weakness, and they decided to hit him where it would hurt the most, the pool table. They recruited Jack Conaway, a wealthy stockbroker from Philadelphia and a champion amateur billiards player. No photos of Conaway survive today, but at the time he was considered one of the finest non-professional pool players in the country, so surely Rothstein didn't stand a chance. On the night of Thursday, November the 18th, 1908, the challenge was issued. Rothstein, never one to back down, pulled out a thick wad of cash and slammed $500 on the table, the equivalent of about $12,000 today, betting that he could beat their champion. The match dragged on for 32 grueling hours, drawing hundreds of spectators into Jack's. And, to everyone's shock, Rothstein and his cue ball won. During the game, the two players continued upping the stakes, so he eventually walked away with $4,000 in winnings, over $130,000 today. As Rothstein's fame grew, so did the size of his world. In August 1909, flush with new wealth, he made his way to Saratoga Springs, the upstate New York retreat that, every August, became the playground of the city's rich and powerful. Anyone who was anyone spent their summers there, and the Saratoga racetrack was the heart of it all. And it was there, during one of the races, that he met Carolyn Green, a beautiful 20-year-old chorus girl born and raised in Saratoga. Rothstein, then 27, was immediately taken with her. But there was one problem: his family. Carolyn's father was Jewish, but her mother was Catholic, and she'd been raised in the Catholic Church with no intention of converting. For Abraham Rothstein, this was a line that couldn't be crossed. He refused to bless the marriage, warning Arnold that if he went through with it, he would be lost to the family forever. But Arnold, as always, was determined to get what he wanted. On August the 30th, 1909, just 2 weeks after they met, Arnold and Carolyn were married in a quiet ceremony without their parents at his home on 185 Washington Street in Saratoga. On the marriage license, Rothstein listed his profession simply as a salesman. But reality set in almost immediately. A losing streak at the racetrack drained Rothstein's funds, and he was forced to pawn Carolyn's 4-carat diamond wedding ring just to afford their train fare back to New York City. It would take him 6 long months to earn enough money to buy it back. Back in New York City, they settled at the Hotel Ansonia on West 73rd and Broadway, where Carolyn quickly discovered that Arnold lived by gambler's hours, coming home at dawn and sleeping until late afternoon. He never touched alcohol, drugs or tobacco, but he was addicted to drinking milk and had an insatiable sweet tooth, especially for cake. He made her a promise. As soon as he made his first $100,000 from gambling, he'd walk away for good. But it was a promise he had no intention of keeping. Instead of quitting, he was preparing to build something far bigger, a brand new headquarters for his gambling empire, in a place that would soon be known by a new name, the House of the Brain. In the fall of 1910, with a bankroll of $12,000, a staggering $436,000 in today's money, Arnold Rothstein leased a 3-story brownstone at 106 West 46th Street to serve as both his residence and the headquarters of his own private gambling house. He slept during the day, hosted games downstairs through the night, and forbade Carolyn from leaving their quarters after 6 p.m. To run an illegal casino of this magnitude, Rothstein needed protection, not from the police, but from those who controlled them. His most important ally was Big Tim Sullivan, the unofficial king of the Lower East Side and a powerful boss within Tammany Hall, the corrupt political machine that controlled New York City. Tammany Hall made its name by helping immigrants and the poor, but behind that charity was a web of election rigging, bribery, and political extortion. Sullivan had known Arnold since he was a teenager and had always admired his sharp mind. He agreed to provide the necessary political cover, but in return, he wanted a cut of the profits. He also insisted that Rothstein partner with one of his own men, Willie Shea, a former ward leader of whom no photographs have survived. At first, business was slow. That changed one night in November 1910 when the son of legendary gambler Bet a Million Gates walked through the door. By the end of the evening, young Charlie Gates had lost $40,000, the equivalent of over $1 million today. Rothstein was ecstatic, but Willie Shea was suspicious. He was anti-Semitic, and he never trusted Rothstein. He accused him of rigging the games to benefit his friends and cooking the books. When the Gates check cleared, Shea took the full $40,000 for himself, claiming that that was what Rothstein owed him. A lesser man might have started a war, but Rothstein was playing a whole different game. Rothstein found Shea drunk and boastful at the Knickerbocker Hotel on the corner of Broadway and 42nd Street. He didn't confront him. Instead, he agreed that Shea could keep the cash, so long as he signed some paperwork. This paperwork was actually a quitclaim, which would give Rothstein full control of the gambling den. But Shea didn't know that. He was convinced by Arnold's cunning that it was actually just to sign the cashing of another check from an unlucky punter the night before. Believing he had outsmarted Rothstein, Shea signed his own name without hesitation, unaware that he had just given up his share on what was about to become a literal goldmine. When he sobered up and realised what he'd done, it was already too late. It was a con that earned Rothstein the nickname of the Brain and meant that in 1912, by the time that he turned 30, Arnold Rothstein was a millionaire. Now the sole owner of the casino, the Brain poured money into the brownstone, transforming it into a lavish house of green and gold, with sparkling crystal chandeliers and velvet-lined walls. He ran it like a business, efficient, elegant, and predatory. He hired steerers, usually young girls who located wealthy customers and brought them into the casino, rewarding them with 10% of whatever the house won. He even paid Broadway showgirls like Lillian Lorraine and Peggy Hopkins Joyce to accompany wealthy men who had attended their shows to the casino, offering them a cut of the losses their companions racked up at the tables. In February 1912, Peggy brought in the biggest fish of all, Percival Hill, the new president of the American Tobacco Company. By the end of the night, Hill had lost $60,000 at the faro table and owed Rothstein a total of $250,000, which was around $8 million today. Carolyn hoped this win would finally be enough to convince Arnold to quit, but Rothstein always had a reason to stay in the game. There was always one more play to make. By 1912, illegal businesses in New York, like Rothstein's casino, operated under a simple system: pay the right cops, pay the right politicians, and they'd look the other way. That system collapsed on the night of July the 15th, when a police lieutenant named Charles Becker ordered the murder of gambler Herman Rosenthal inside Rothstein's former haunt, the Hotel Metropole, just off Times Square. Herman Rosenthal was one of the many gamblers paying Lieutenant Charles Becker for police protection, but over time, as the payments grew steeper and the demands more frequent, he began to feel trapped, bled dry by the very system that was meant to shield him. So he made a decision that would cost him his life. He went to the newspapers and then to the one man that Lieutenant Becker truly feared, District Attorney Charles Whitman. Whitman was a reformer, one of the few honest men in a deeply corrupt system, and he was looking to make a name for himself. When Rosenthal agreed to testify, he effectively signed his own death warrant. Political boss Tom Foley, a key player in Tammany Hall, got word to Arnold Rothstein that Rosenthal had to be silenced. Rothstein tried to warn him. He even offered Rosenthal money to disappear, to leave town for good, but Rosenthal refused. By the time he changed his mind, it was already too late. In the early hours of July the 15th, 1912, Rosenthal was lured outside the Hotel Metropole. At around 1:40 a.m, a car screeched to a halt at the curb. Moments later, Rosenthal was dead on the sidewalk, shot 5 times, with 3 bullets in the head and 1 to the back. District Attorney Whitman immediately accused the NYPD. He publicly declared that Herman Rosenthal had been murdered by the police. Faced with a scandal that threatened to unravel everything, Tammany Hall moved quickly to protect its own. Becker, once their golden boy, became the fall guy. By the 29th of July, the 4 gunmen had been rounded up, all Jewish gangsters from the Lower East Side. Jip the Blood Horowitz, Lefty Louis Rosenberg, Whitey Lewis, and Dago Frank Chirifici. Becker claimed innocence, but it didn't matter. His former criminal associates were offered deals in exchange for testimony, and they turned on him. On July the 30th, 1915, Charles Becker became the first and the only police officer ever in American history to be executed for murder, strapped into Old Sparky at Sing Sing prison. The fallout from the Becker case sent shockwaves through the city's underworld. Newspapers fanned public outrage, and reformers seized the moment, demanding a crackdown on corruption and illegal gambling. Police raids intensified and dozens of gambling dens were shuttered, and even politically protected operations found themselves under threat. Rothstein, who had long operated with quiet impunity, understood that the old ways were no longer sustainable. He needed a new model, one that elevated gambling above suspicion and cloaked it in respectability. Rothstein saw something that the others missed. The appetite for gambling hadn't gone away, it had just moved upscale. Around 1912, he purchased the NASA Hotel in Long Beach, with Nat Evans, a close friend and fellow gambler who shared Rothstein's instincts for discretion and profit. Together, they transformed the property into a high-end resort. Rothstein poached staff and chefs from Sherry's, one of New York's most exclusive restaurants on East 44th Street, and reimagined the Nassau as a haven for the city's wealthy elite. His philosophy was simple: snob appeal. He once said, "People like to think they're better than other people, as long as they're willing to pay to prove it. I'm willing to let them in." While his guests sipped champagne, Rothstein stuck by milk and cake, a quiet quirk that, strangely, seemed to impress the local community. But gambling was just the visible tip of his empire. By now, Rothstein was acting as a silent partner, financer, and fixer across every major industry touched by vice and ambition. He lent $20,000 to the composer Irving Berlin, who used the money to produce his international hit, Alexander's Ragtime Band. He also loaned $50,000 to producers Archie and Edgar Selwyn to build the state-of-the-art 1,000-seater Selwyn Theatre on 42nd Street. When a labor racketeer from Chicago tried to extort the Selwyns, one call from Rothstein cut the demand from $50,000 to $10,000. When producer George White needed financing, Rothstein provided it, but at a crushing interest rate. He did the same with playwright Ann Nichols, loaning her $25,000 to stage Abbey's Irish Rose, but not before forcing her to buy thousands of dollars in insurance policies from him, guaranteeing profit no matter what happened. The play became a massive success and Rothstein had passed on a chance to own a share of it. That was a mistake that cost him over $1 million. When Nichols paid back the loan, she cancelled every policy she had with him, furious at how she'd been manipulated. But these deals weren't just about money. They were about influence. Doors opened, enemies removed, and problems solved. Rothstein's wealth was no longer measured in cash. It came in favours owed, institutions leaned on, and people quietly controlled. And now, with his connections stretching from Tammany Hall to Broadway, Rothstein turned his attention to a new frontier, one that provided steady money, political leverage, and a stranglehold on the working backbone of New York City. It was time to enter the garment industry. In the early 20th century, New York's garment district was a world of organised chaos. The working conditions were horrific. Factories were dirty, overcrowded fire traps where immigrant women and girls worked 12-hour days. They were charged for the needles they used, the lockers that held their things, and even the chairs that they sat on. It was a system built on exploitation, and it was about to break. The first explosion came in 1909, when 20,000 women walked off the job in a massive strike, but the true horror that would change everything came on March the 25th, 1911. A fire swept through the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, and the owners, paranoid about union organisers, had locked the doors from the outside. With no way out, 146 workers, mostly young women, were burned alive or were forced to jump from the windows to their deaths. That tragedy forced change, but the change wasn't peaceful. As powerful new unions formed to fight the factory owners, both sides started hiring muscle, turning to the city's toughest gangsters to fight their battles for them. Men that used to rule the Lower East Side as Rothstein started hanging around gambling dens in his youth, like Monk Eastman and Big Jack Zelig, became the unofficial negotiators, using fists, blackjacks and bullets to settle disputes. But it was a gangster called Dopey Benny Fine who dominated this racket. Naturally, Rothstein found a way into this lucrative racket. In 1914, Dopey Benny was arrested for extortion. When his union bosses came to Rothstein for bail money, Rothstein's advice was as cold as it was simple: let him rot in jail. Rothstein knew that 26-year-old Benny would eventually squeal to the NYPD. By sacrificing Dopey Benny, Rothstein got rid of the man at the top of the food chain and made himself look good to the city's new district attorney, Francis Martin. The unions did exactly as Rothstein said, and after Benny finally broke and ratted everyone out, Rothstein suddenly produced the bail money for all the men that Benny had implicated, ensuring their loyalty was now to him and him alone. With Dopey Benny gone, Rothstein needed a new man to run his labour rackets. He lured Monk Eastman and Jack Zeelig onto his payroll, and, whilst they were good muscle, they lacked the brains he needed, so he chose one of Benny's old thugs, a man named Jacob Little Augie Organ. Little Augie was a brawler who didn't care who he hurt, willing to use force for the unions one day and the bosses the next, but he did have brains, and he was the type of man that Rothstein wanted. Under Rothstein's guidance, Little Augie built a new kind of gang. In the old days, gangs were split along ethnic lines, Irish, Jewish or Italian, but Rothstein's world was only about money. Little Augie hired his fellow Jews like Louis Lepke Buchalter and Jacob Garage Shapiro, but he also brought in notorious Irish gunmen like the rising ruthless duo Brothers Legs and Eddie Diamond. With Rothstein's backing, Organ muscled his way into the garment industry's underworld economy, an economy not built on clothing, but on control. Control of labour unions, trucking routes, shipping docks and factory floors. And Rothstein, quietly pulling the strings behind it all, had just opened up the next chapter of his empire. With Monk and Jack's muscle, Little Augie's organisation, and Rothstein's capital and cunning, the garment industry was now his. It became one of the most profitable rackets, not because it made headlines, but because it didn't. The money was steady, the corruption quiet, and the profits monumental. As a result of the NASA and the garment industry, by 1914 Rothstein wasn't just rich, he was one of the wealthiest men in New York, but money alone wasn't enough. Control, prestige and perception mattered to him just as much. He didn't want to be seen as a gangster, he wanted to be a gentleman of influence, a kingmaker if you would, in tailored suits, and the next world he set out to conquer would take him from the factory floors to the racetrack stands, where fortunes were made not in cloth, but in speed, odds and deception. It was now time for the brain to fix the sport of kings. Arnold Rothstein approached the world of horse racing with the same cold, calculating precision that he applied to everything else. He didn't just bet on horses, he owned racetracks, stables, fixed races, manipulated odds, and built a system of control the sport had never seen before. At first, Rothstein played it like any other wealthy man, betting big, tipping jockeys, entertaining guests in the grandstands. But soon, he wanted more than luck. He wanted certainty. And with enough money and influence, certainty could be bought. Within a few years, he had almost every jockey and trainer in New York State on his payroll. He didn't need to fix every race, just the right ones. At any given meeting, Rothstein had the winner already picked out. To avoid suspicion, he brought in men from the Lower East Side, like Little Augie and Monk Eastman, to place bets on his behalf across dozens of different stalls. It was a perfectly orchestrated fraud. On some days, Rothstein left the track with over $30,000 in winnings, nearly $1 million in today's money, and you could be sure of one thing: everyone who helped him fiddle the race got their cut. Rothstein was generous to those who earned it. If he won, everyone won. And soon, he didn't just want to own the jockeys and the stables, he wanted to own the sport itself. he made a move into racetrack ownership in 1914, targeting Maryland's Havre de Grace racecourse, where he partnered with the powerful financier August Belmont II. With Rothstein's connections and backing, the track quickly became profitable, even too profitable. Rothstein's enormous share of the earnings sparked resentment, and when Belmont's attempts to buy him out failed, he successfully lobbied for a new law limiting non-Maryland residents to just 75 shares in any local track. Rothstein was advised to fight the measure, but instead he accepted defeat, and he sold his shares quietly for $50 apiece. But he didn't forget the insult. In October 1917, 50 miles from Havre de Grace at the Laurel racetrack, Rothstein saw his chance for revenge. A high-stakes race was scheduled between two champion horses, Omar Khayyam, the first foreign-bred horse to win the Kentucky Derby, and Belmont's prized runner, Hourless. Rothstein publicly announced he was placing a staggering $240,000 bet, over $6 million today, on Hourless. But behind the scenes, he got wind that Belmont planned to fix the race by having his jockey deliberately lose the race by holding Hourless back. Rather than interfere, Rothstein let the fix proceed, or so Belmont thought. In secret, Arnold arranged for an honest jockey to ride Hourless at the last minute. The race went off as planned. Hourless surged ahead and crossed the line with a world record time of 2 minutes and 2 seconds. Rothstein walked away with $300,000, more than $7 million in today's money. Belmont was furious. He attempted to have Rothstein banned from Maryland and New York racetracks entirely, but Rothstein simply threatened to use his fortune and his political connections to shut down racing in New York altogether. Belmont backed off, and a weak compromise was offered. Rothstein could attend the races, but he had to stop publicly announcing his huge bets. Rothstein agreed and broke the promise whenever it suited him. As a sure-thing gambler, Rothstein employed every tactic available to tilt the odds in his favour. One of his favourites was horse sponging, a method where a small sponge was secretly placed inside the nostril of a rival horse to restrict its breathing during the race. But Rothstein also had something that few others did: a team of experts. He had Ben Silverman, another mathematical genius, who handled the numbers. Then there was William Collins, a veteran of the track, who knew everything from bloodlines to a horse's temperament. Rothstein trusted them both. Every afternoon, Carolyn, his wife, would place bets by the phone based on their advice. Rothstein's instructions were clear: bet 10 times whatever Collins recommended, and bet even more if both Collins and Silverman agreed. But for a man like Rothstein, fixing the odds was never enough. He wanted the house itself. And in 1919, when all gambling apart from horse racing was still illegal, he made his boldest move yet. In late 1917, Arnold Rothstein purchased Bonnie Brook Farm in Saratoga, just west of the grounds of the Saratoga Golf Club, and transformed it into something the country had never seen before: a casino as opulent and refined as any private club in Manhattan. He called it the Brook, and it made the NASA look like one of the sketchy gambling dens he hung around as a teenager on the Lower East Side. Running an illegal casino of this scale required more than just discretion. It demanded protection, and Rothstein secured it the way he secured everything else, with cash. He paid off the local Democratic boss, a cadre of well-placed Republicans, and even the district attorney, Charles Andrus, a man who had once vowed that he'd never let that Jew open a gambling house in Saratoga, whilst Rothstein was making offers for places in the area. But when Rothstein laid $60,000 in front of him, Andrus quickly changed his mind. The payoff worked exactly as intended. Whenever the authorities scheduled a raid, Rothstein received advance warning, and the Brook was always spotless by the time the police arrived. It became a magnet for the rich, the reckless, and the powerful. Oil barons, Wall Street financiers, and legendary gamblers like Nick the Greek Dandalos came to test their luck and lose in Rothstein's house. He watched them drop hundreds of thousands in a single night without the faintest reaction. One construction magnate from Minsk in Belarus, Subway Sam Rozov, once ran up $400,000 in winnings, nearly breaking the house before losing it all. A stockbroker once lost $70,000 playing roulette over the telephone from his hotel room, and an Oklahoma oilman, Joshua Cosden, blew $500,000 over 2 nights and laughed about it. But beneath the glamour, Rothstein was still Rothstein. The casino was strategically placed near the Saratoga racetrack because he couldn't resist rigging the races. His most ambitious plan was to win $1 million on a single race with his own horse, Sailing Bee. He deployed a network of agents around the country, ordering them to place massive bets just 2 minutes before the race began, a tactic designed to keep the bookmakers from slashing the odds. But one agent in Detroit, wearing a watch 20 minutes fast, placed his bets too early and the odds crashed. Sailing Bee still won, but the mistake cost Rothstein dearly. He walked away with just $250,000 and he was livid. A cheap watch had cost him a fortune. Later that summer, he pulled off another major coup at the Travers Stakes. Rothstein knew that his horse, Sporting Blood, was in better shape than the heavy favourite, Prudery. To manipulate the odds, he convinced the owner of another contender, Grey Lag, to enter the race and then withdraw at the last minute. The public assumed that Grey Lag had been withdrawn to give Prudery an easier win, making Sporting Blood look like a long shot. Rothstein placed $150,000 on his horse at inflated odds. The race was fixed and Sporting Blood coasted to victory, and Rothstein collected $450,000. He was now making more money than he had ever seen in Saratoga, but the kind of money that he was raking in, week after week, was starting to draw attention, and not the kind of attention that came with handshakes and smiles. Living in a world of criminals while constantly carrying vast sums of money made Arnold Rothstein a walking target. To protect himself, he hired bodyguards like former featherweight boxing champion Abe Attell and the feared gangster already on his payroll, Monk Eastman. And thanks to his deep political connections, Rothstein held a legal permit to carry a revolver, a rare privilege in a city where most carried one illegally. But even Rothstein's careful precautions occasionally failed him. On the night of May the 16th, 1917, whilst hosting a high-stakes card game at the Hotel St. Francis in San Francisco, masked gunmen stormed the room. As the guests were forced up against the wall, Rothstein calmly slid his entire bankroll, estimated at $60,000, beneath the edge of the carpet. The thieves, unaware of the hidden cash, made off with what they could see: $2,600, a gold watch, and a $3,500 pearl pin, but they didn't get the bankroll. True to his style, no one in the room called the police. Rothstein handled his problems privately. But when journalist Herbert Bayard Swope, present during the robbery, mocked him as a coward for staying silent, Rothstein, stung by the insult, broke his usual rule. For the first and only time in his life, he picked up the telephone and called the authorities. The culprits were soon arrested, but one, a violent, drug-addicted criminal named Albert the Killer Johnson, of whom no photos have survived, vowed from behind bars that he would murder Rothstein if he ever got the chance. 2 months later, Johnson escaped from prison and began stalking Rothstein across Manhattan, even following him to Rise and Weber's restaurant at Columbus Circle. Whilst Rothstein was having dinner, Monk Eastman spotted Johnson outside Reisenweber's. Monk kidnapped Johnson and beat him severely with his crew. He told Johnson he'd end up at the bottom of the East River if he ever returned, and Johnson was never seen again. In 1918, Rothstein turned his attention to loan sharking on a scale few had ever seen before. He began fronting enormous sums to gamblers, gangsters, and desperate businessmen, often at brutal interest rates. But Rothstein wasn't interested in broken legs. He wanted guarantees. Anyone who couldn't pay was required to take out a life insurance policy, with Rothstein's company listed as the sole beneficiary. If the debtor still failed to come through, Monk Eastman paid them a visit. Debts were collected swiftly and permanently, but when Monk volunteered for service in World War I, the muscle behind the racket disappeared. Rothstein, ever pragmatic, shut the operation down, at least until he could find a new enforcer who inspired the same kind of fear. The following year, on January the 19th, 1919, Rothstein was presiding over another private dice game in a 4th-floor apartment in New York when someone pounded the door. Fearing another robbery, he drew his pistol and fired 3 shots straight through the wooden frame. On the other side stood 8 police detectives. 3 officers were struck and injured, but survived. What happened next demonstrated the immense reach of Rothstein's influence. He vanished during the raid, only to be found minutes later on a 2nd-floor fire escape, after a bystander pointed him out to the police. When Rothstein learned that 3 of the detectives had been wounded, he insisted they take his Rolls-Royce limousine to the hospital rather than wait for an ambulance. That same night, when the bail was set at $1,000 for each gambler in the apartment, the big bankroll covered the total amount in cash, peeling off bills from a thick roll of thousands he carried in his pocket. Despite the incident, Rothstein faced minimal consequences, though the officers admitted that they may have not identified themselves clearly, and Rothstein did, after all, have a valid pistol permit. It was still clear that something more powerful than legality was at play. He employed Bill the Great Mouthpiece Fallon, one of New York's most feared trial attorneys, as well as former magistrate Emil Fuchs, to defend him. Edward Swan convened a grand jury to investigate the shooting, but it went nowhere. Every gambler present suddenly suffered a collective amnesia. Most couldn't remember who fired the shots. Some couldn't even remember if shots had been fired at all. The NYPD apparently suffered from the same amnesia because not one of the 8 cops present could point out who fired the shots. Judge Francis McQuaid, an old associate of Rothstein's, dismissed the case, ensuring that Rothstein walked free. He had shot 3 police officers and faced no punishment. By then, it was clear even Rothstein's most audacious crimes were tolerated by the city's power structure. It was around this time that rumours circulated that he'd earned as much as $5 million through a scheme involving stolen Liberty bonds, bearer instruments designed to support America's war effort during World War I. Working with gambler Nicky Armstein, husband of the famous Fanny Bryce, Rothstein arranged for cooperative messengers to be robbed for a fee, handing over bonds that could be cashed by whoever held them. He also began dabbling deeper in labour racketeering, offering loans to the Communist Party and helping grease palms at the judicial and police levels to ensure favourable outcomes. Any lingering doubts about Rothstein's reach was erased when Police Commissioner George McLaughlin attempted to revoke his pistol permit. The effort was short-lived. Political pressure came down swiftly and McLaughlin was forced to resign. The very next day, Rothstein's permit was reinstated, a symbolic moment that made one thing crystal clear. In New York City, even the law answered to Arnold Rothstein, and it was this staggering level of influence, this freedom to act with impunity, that gave him the confidence to orchestrate what remains to this day, the greatest sporting scandal in the history of American sports. The 1919 World Series was meant to be a proud moment for American baseball, a showdown between the talented Chicago White Sox and the underdog, the Cincinnati Reds. Instead, it became one of the biggest scandals in sports history. Known forever as the Black Sox scandal, it saw 8 White Sox players accused of deliberately losing the series in exchange for bribes from gamblers. The reasons for this were rooted in resentment and money. Many of the White Sox players, despite being stars, were underpaid and poorly treated by their tight-fisted owner, Charles Comiskey. So, when gamblers approached them with the promise of big payouts to throw the series, some of the team's top talent agreed. But behind those gamblers stood someone far more powerful, Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein was operating quietly from behind the scenes. He never met directly with the players, and, in fact, when a gambler named Billy Mahog and a washed-up pitcher named Bill Sleepy Burns approached Rothstein in New York, asking him to finance the fix, he publicly turned them down, but privately, he sent 2 trusted associates, the Boston bookmaker Sport Sullivan and his longtime bodyguard and boxer Abe Attell, to Chicago with $80,000 to put their plan into motion. Rothstein knew how to manage risk. He didn't intend to pay the players everything they'd been promised, just enough to keep the fix in place. Before the first game, pitcher Eddie Seacott received $10,000 as a sign that the deal was real. And in Game 1, the fix played out perfectly. The White Sox lost 9-1 and Rothstein's men began placing massive bets on the Reds, not just in Cincinnati, but across the Midwest, carefully avoiding attention in New York. But things soon got messy. After the first game, the players weren't paid any more money. Distrust grew, and some players got cold feet, others got angry. The Sox lost games 2, 4 and 5, but out of frustration and confusion, they won games 6 and 7, threatening to ruin the entire plan. Rothstein wasn't about to let that happen. Before Game 8, he made sure the message was clear. A $500 payment was given to an enforcer who warned pitcher Lefty Williams that his wife's safety was at risk if he didn't throw the game. Williams took the mound and collapsed immediately, giving up 5 runs in the first inning. The Reds won 10-5 and Rothstein walked away with a fortune. The players were eventually indicted, but Rothstein's name never appeared on any official list. He denied involvement from beginning to end, claiming that he'd merely placed bets like anyone else. Everyone in the underworld knew the truth. Arnold Rothstein hadn't just profited from the Black Sox scandal, he had quietly engineered it from start to finish. On September the 27th, 1920, the scandal finally broke wide open. Billy Mahog confessed the entire scheme to a Philadelphia newspaper, and a wave of admissions followed from Eddie Seacott, Shoeless Joe Jackson, Lefty Williams, and Happy Felsch. Even New York Giants legend John McGraw testified, implicating other players and gamblers. With the net closing in, Rothstein brought in the best defense attorney money could buy and once again leaned on Bill, the great mouthpiece Fallon. Fallon quickly arranged for Abe Attell and Sport Sullivan to disappear, one to Montreal, the other to Mexico, their expenses quietly covered by Rothstein. When the time came, Rothstein appeared before the grand jury in Chicago. He presented himself as a clean-handed sportsman who would simply place bets. Rothstein's distance from the events, along with his legal firepower and influence, worked. He walked away again without an indictment. Meanwhile, whilst Rothstein could not be connected to the scandal, the 8 White Sox players and the 3 men being the go-between, Abe Attell, Sport Sullivan, and Nat Evans, were indicted on charges of conspiracy to defraud bettors and damage Comiskey's business. Rothstein paid for the great mouthpiece again for each man, and Fallon returned to his usual tricks. In court, he used what became known as the two-a-tells tactic, producing a look-alike witness to confuse identification and further obstruct the prosecution. The ruse succeeded, and neither Attell, Sport Sullivan or Nat Evans had to testify in Chicago. Then, in a final twist, the most important pieces of information, signed confessions from Seacott, Jackson and Williams, vanished from the prosecutor's office. Ben Johnson, president of the American League, publicly accused Rothstein of orchestrating their disappearance. But without those confessions, the state's case collapsed. On August 2nd, 1921, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, and all defendants were acquitted. The players were banned from baseball for life, but Arnold Rothstein, the man who pulled the strings, the man who corrupted the heart of the game, was never punished. By the early 20th century, the stiff moral codes of the Victorian age were breaking down. In their place, a new American culture was rising, bold, brazen, and unafraid to indulge. Gambling halls, brothels, and saloons operated in plain sight, especially in big cities like New York and Chicago. But not everyone welcomed the change. The temperance movement, led by preachers and reformers, blamed alcohol for the country's worst problems: crime, corruption, poverty, and broken homes. To them, the liquor bottle was the source of it all. On January the 18th, 1920, they won, and the 18th Amendment came into effect, banning the sale, production, and transportation of alcohol across the United States. America was officially dry, but the thirst hadn't gone anywhere. Speakeasies began to appear in every corner of New York, discreet, hidden venues where anyone with the right connection or password could get a drink without drawing the attention of the police or federal prohibition agents. Quietly, the city's nightlife transformed. By the peak of Prohibition, it's estimated that New York alone had more than 32,000 of these illicit bars. And with numbers like that, there was no doubt that Arnold Rothstein would want his share. But the truth was, he didn't just want his share. Just like the garment labour racketeering, the gambling dens, the World Series fix and the horse racing, Rothstein wanted to own the whole thing. Months before the law took effect, he made quiet trips to Scotland and England, purchasing barrels of aging whiskey directly from distillers. He arranged shipping routes using legitimate freighters that anchored at a place known as Rum Row, a floating liquor market that stretched along the East Coast, just beyond the 3-mile limit of US jurisdiction. His ships, loaded with the whiskey, waited offshore in international waters, safe from federal law. From there, under the cover of darkness, a fleet of fast boats would transfer the liquor to waiting trucks on shore. These trucks were protected by men on Rothstein's payroll, like Legs and Eddie Diamond, and a ruthless up-and-coming mobster called Arthur Flegenheimer, who was better known as Dutch Schultz. They safely moved the cargo inland and distributed Rothstein's product to speakeasies and clubs. The whole system relied on precision and bribes. Rothstein greased the palms of Coast Guard officers, local police, and state troopers alike. For Rothstein, corruption was just another business expense. The money from booze quite literally flowed in. It was fast, huge amounts, and like nothing he had ever seen before. Compared to his rackets, that was really saying something. But even with Dutch, Legs and Eddie working for him, as vicious as they were, if Rothstein wanted to control all the booze in New York, he needed an army of young, hungry and brilliant minds who could run the streets for him. One of those minds belonged to an 18-year-old kid from Brooklyn named Meyer Lansky. Lansky was known as the little man, but he had a mind for numbers and strategy that rivaled Rothstein's own. Rothstein invited the young Hood to dinner, where he laid out his grand vision. He told Lansky and his partner, a hot-headed Italian named Charlie Lucky Luciano, that Prohibition was their chance to get richer than they could ever imagine. But there were two ways to do it. The foolish way was to sell cheap, diluted gut rot, making a quick buck and earning a bad name. The smart way, and Rothstein's way, was to build a brand. They would only deal in the best scotch. They would become the trusted suppliers for every millionaire, politician, and socialite in New York. Of course, most of them Rothstein knew personally. Their partnership expanded quickly. Rothstein would supply liquor from Europe. Lansky and Luciano would manage distribution through a network of smugglers, drivers, and enforcers. The plan birthed a new generation of gangland icons and introduced the brightest potential to come under Rothstein's wing. Dutch Schultz, Legs Diamond, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello all became Rothstein's proteges who succeeded in showing these rough street kids how to transform crime from a street-level thuggish activity into a corporation, how to organise it, how to run it properly, and how to make millions. He was the first to organise crime like this, and he created the blueprint. Arnold Rothstein had built the mob. Rothstein took a personal interest in Lucky Luciano. Luciano was a natural gangster, already making a fortune from prostitution and drugs, but he had no class. In 1923, he was caught by federal agents with a stash of heroin, and, to save himself, he informed on his associates. Overnight, his high-class booze customers wanted nothing to do with him, and other criminals saw him as a rat. So Rothstein came up with a plan to fix his reputation. Luciano bought 200 ringside seats to the legendary Jack Dempsey-Louis Firpo heavyweight fight, paying a staggering $25,000. He then gave every single ticket away to the most important people he knew, gangsters, businessmen, and politicians, and suddenly everyone wanted to be friends with Lucky Luciano once more. For the big night, Luciano needed to look the part. Rothstein himself took him shopping, not to a flashy tailor, but to a department store. He taught Luciano the power of quiet elegance, picking out a beautiful double-breasted dark grey suit, a plain white shirt, and a dark blue silk tie. After that night, Luciano, the former street thug, became known for his impeccable style. Rothstein had given him a new image, one that projected power and class, not cheap crime. Rothstein's empire was always growing. He was a master of turning liabilities into assets. In 1921, a con artist named Dapper Don Collins, who already owed Rothstein $11,000, came to him with a deal to buy cheap scotch in the Bahamas. Rothstein didn't trust him for a second. First, he found a buyer for the liquor before he even bought it. Next, he sent his own man to the Bahamas, who discovered that the whiskey was even cheaper than Collins had claimed. Rothstein immediately cut Collins out, bought the liquor himself, and pocketed the extra profit. The only loser was Dapper Don, who later had his own share of the booze stolen by Legs Diamond, the very man that Rothstein had hired to guard it. In Rothstein's world, there were no partners, there was only profits. Legs had started to work for Rothstein in 1917, after proving his value in delivering stolen goods. He helped break garment factory strikes using violence and intimidation, winning Rothstein's admiration. Rothstein hired him as a bodyguard and brought him deeper into the organisation. By 1923, the Diamond brothers were hijacking liquor full-time for Rothstein. Jack proposed a shortcut. Why buy from other bootleggers when you can just rob them? Rothstein agreed. He gave the Diamonds trucks and a drop-off point, and business boomed. But Jack's taste for chaos would nearly spark a war. His hijackings began to hit the wrong people, namely Big Bill Dwyer, Oni Madden, and Frank Costello, who by this time had left Rothstein's organisation on amicable terms. The three men had created their own rum-running crew, calling it The Combination, and they were Rothstein's main competition. though there was no bad blood between the outfits. At first, they tolerated Jack Diamond out of respect for Rothstein, but as the hijackings mounted, they changed course. On July 1st, 1925, just after 4 a.m, Jack was ambushed by Costello's gunmen on 5th Avenue. A shotgun blast and pistol fire left him riddled with buckshot and a bullet in the heel, but somehow he survived. Rothstein negotiated a truce. Jack would stop robbing Dwyer and Costello's shipments, and they'd stop trying to murder him. But the vast amounts of money and booze flowing into the city attracted attention from the handful of legit Prohibition agents not paid off by Arnold. Raids began occurring more frequently, and Rothstein even found a way to monetize them. Under Prohibition law, if a raid turned up nothing, a judge could issue a 1-year ban on future raids for that address. Rothstein paid police to conduct fake, evidence-free raids, and then used his judicial connections to get protection orders. He rented out these raid-proof properties for $50,000 a year to speakeasy owners looking to increase their property portfolio. When one honest cop tried to expose the scheme in 1925, the court shut him down. Everybody figured that Arnold Rothstein had something to do with it, the officer said, but the investigator, in Rothstein's pocket, replied, "What everybody figures is too often something nobody knows," and the case collapsed. By the mid-1920s, Arnold Rothstein had built the most sophisticated criminal enterprise in American history, fueled by bootlegging, protected by corruption, and operated by a generation of gangsters that he had trained himself: Luciano, Lansky, Schultz, Costello, Siegel, Diamond. They weren't just criminals, they were Rothstein's legacy. He wasn't just selling liquor, he was selling order, and everyone, cops, crooks and kings alike, had to pay the toll. But alcohol was only one piece of the empire. Rothstein understood something that few others did. Influence didn't just stop at the street corner or the club door. It extended into boardrooms, courtrooms, and the boxing ring. Prize fighting was one of the most popular sports in the country, a spectacle that blended violence, glamour, and money. And whenever there was money to be made, Rothstein wasn't far behind, and he set his eyes on a new racket. In the early 20th century, boxing in New York City was a dirty, crooked business. For the right price, any law could be bent and any license could be bought, and it was a world that the city's master fixer, Arnold Rothstein, understood better than anyone. So, when a boxing manager named Billy Gibson needed a promoter's license, he didn't bother with the paperwork, he went straight to AR, who made a single phone call to Tammany Hall's Tom Foley. And, just like that, Gibson was in business. But Rothstein's help was never a gift. In return for the favour, he was given a 10% stake in Gibson's rising star, a lightweight champion named Benny Leonard. For Rothstein, owning a piece of a champion was like owning a racehorse that always won. In January 1921, Benny Leonard was set to defend his title against Richie Mitchell, a man he had already knocked out with ease. Leonard was so confident, he told Rothstein to bet $25,000 on him winning by knockout in the very first round. The fight started just as planned. Leonard dropped Mitchell 3 times in under 2 minutes, but then Mitchell landed a wild punch that sent the champion crashing to the mat. Saved by the bell, a dazed Leonard staggered through the next few rounds before finally finishing Mitchell in the 6th. After the fight, Leonard was terrified, but Rothstein was calm. As it turned out, his legendary luck had held once again, and he simply told Leonard that he never got around to placing the bet. But even a master manipulator like Rothstein could be played. Harry Greb, the middleweight champion, was one of the dirtiest fighters in the game, known as the Human Windmill. In 1925, He was scheduled to fight Mickey the Toy Bulldog Walker, and Rothstein, Luciano and co. had bet a mountain of cash on Greb to win. But at 2 a.m, on the day of the fight, they watched as a taxi pulled up outside their favourite restaurant, Lindy's, located at 1626 Broadway. They were sat inside. A hopelessly drunk Harry Greb stumbled out of the taxi, held up by 2 women, before being shoved back in the cab. Convinced their man was in no shape to fight, Rothstein's crew frantically changed their bets, putting all their money on Walker instead. When Greb entered the ring, however, he looked fresh and sharp. A reporter asked him how he felt. Greb grinned and said, "Great. How did those gamblers like my performance last night?" He then proceeded to fight his usual foul-filled, brutal match, winning a clear decision. He had staged the whole drunken scene to fool Rothstein, causing the betting odds to shift so that he and his friends could make a fortune on betting on himself. For once, Arnold Rothstein, the man who fixed everything, had been fixed himself. But Rothstein always got his money back. A few months later, Mickey Walker fought a tough brawler named Dave Shade. For 15 rounds, Shade beat Walker from one end of the ring to the other in a completely one-sided fight. Everyone in the stadium knew Shade had won. Everyone, that is, except the judges, who shockingly gave the win to Walker. The next day, newspapers reported that Rothstein had won $60,000 on the crooked decision. When asked, Rothstein corrected them. He'd actually won $80,000, and now it was clear that the judges were in his pocket. While fighters like Leonard, Greb and Walker were stars, the biggest name in boxing, perhaps of all time, was the heavyweight champion Jack Dempsey. After a brutal fight in 1923, Dempsey took a long break from the ring. By 1926, a match was set against Gene Tunney, a smart, technical boxer who was considered a massive underdog. Over 120,000 fans packed into Philadelphia's sesquicentennial stadium, and the bookmakers were certain that Dempsey would win. But just days before the fight, Tunney's manager, Billy Gibson, secretly met with Rothstein. Gibson was terrified that powerful gangsters were working to make sure his fighter would lose. Rothstein told him not to worry. He called Boo Boo Hoff, the mob boss who ran Philadelphia, and the guy who had been trying to sabotage Tunney. Rothstein told him Gibson's fighter needed protection. Hoff agreed, but for a steep price. In a secret deal, Tunney and Gibson signed away 20% of all of Tunney's future earnings as champion in exchange for protection, and Boo Boo Hoff put all his money on Gene Tunney and now looked at sabotaging Dempsey. With the fix now secure, Rothstein bet a staggering $125,000 on Tunney to win. On fight night, a pale and shaky Dempsey, who had mysteriously fallen ill that morning, was easily outboxed for 10 rounds. Tunney became the new champion, and Rothstein walked away with over $500,000. Dempsey was certain he'd been sabotaged. Convinced that gangsters had tampered with his food at the hotel, he penned a fiery letter to the newspapers, exposing what he believed to be a calculated plot to poison him before the fight. His accusations stirred public outrage, but no proof emerged at the time. It wasn't until years later that Rothstein's longtime associate, Abe Attell, came forward and confirmed what Dempsey had always suspected. His food at the hotel had been tampered with, and the fix had been in from the start. With the Dempsey scandal behind him and Abe Attell's quiet confession confirming just how deep his influence ran, Rothstein had tightened his grip on yet another racket. He now controlled a significant portion of the fight game, from managers to promoters to judges and the fighters themselves. But this was just one stream in a river of revenue. By the mid-1920s, Arnold Rothstein had become the single biggest importer of illicit liquor in the United States. His casinos, racetracks and underground card games were turning over millions. His connections in labour racketeering allowed him to dictate terms to both unions and employers. He had the police in his pocket, politicians on his payroll, and an army of enforcers who only answered to him alone. Luciano, Lansky, Costello, Siegel, Schultz and Legs Diamond. As he entered his 40s, Rothstein wasn't just making money, he was defining the era. The Roaring Twenties were in full swing, and at the centre of its glittering chaos stood one man, quietly orchestrating it all. It was time for Arnold Rothstein to step into his prime and become the king of the Roaring Twenties. By the mid-1920s, New York City was throbbing with jazz, drenched in bootleg liquor, and electrified by the illusion of endless prosperity. It was an era of unrelenting appetite for pleasure, for wealth, for status, and no figure personified the decadent ambition of the Roaring Twenties more than Arnold Rothstein. In a city where fortunes were made overnight and the line between high society and the criminal underworld was vanishing fast, Rothstein stood at the intersection of both worlds. He wasn't just rich, he was powerful in a way few men could ever be. With his fingers deep in every vice the age had to offer, he engineered a criminal empire that was both subtle and sprawling. At a time when law enforcement was fragmented and compromised, Rothstein's ability to buy silence and loyalty meant there were few places his influence didn't reach. Prohibition, far from curbing alcohol consumption, had given rise to an enormous black market, and Rothstein had claimed the top. He was now the largest importer of illegal liquor in the United States, with networks that stretched from distilleries in Glasgow and London to speakeasies tucked behind barbershops, restaurants, and jazz clubs in Harlem and Midtown Manhattan. His name was never on any lease, but he had financial stakes in hundreds of clubs across New York, from the glitzy Cotton Club on Lenox Avenue, where Duke Ellington's orchestra played to packed crowds of white elites, to the more discreet Silver Slipper speakeasy tucked away at 48th and Broadway, where Broadway stars, Wall Street brokers, and city politicians rubbed elbows in the dim glow of chandeliers. Rothstein's control over the flow of alcohol was both logistical and political. He arranged the shipments, coordinated the fleets of trucks, bribed the dock workers, and paid off every relevant official, from the Coast Guard to the mayor's office. His empire was held together not just by violence and fear, but by cold, calculated professionalism. He operated like a corporation, efficient, disciplined, and deeply corrupt. By 1925, he'd become so integral to the bootlegging economy that even rival gangs relied on his shipments to stock their own clubs. He wasn't just a player in the Prohibition racket, he was the infrastructure. But liquor was only one stream of income in a sea of profit. Rothstein had carved up the entire underworld of New York. He owned and operated at least 7 casinos across New York and oversaw hundreds of gambling dens, each bringing in thousands of dollars per week. He didn't run dice games in back alleys. His gambling operations were housed in brownstones and hotels, luxuriously decorated and protected by the local police forces, who were paid handsomely to keep their eyes shut. Rothstein's games were high stakes and meticulously managed. The house always won, but Rothstein was the house. He also now controlled a significant portion of boxing. Every major fight that took place in New York during the 1920s had Rothstein's fingerprints on it. Whether it was by fixing a judge, paying off a referee, or managing the career of a promising fighter, Rothstein understood the importance of betting markets and how to manipulate public perception. When people placed bets, they were gambling against a man who had already determined the outcome. Even in the more respectable spheres of business and politics, Rothstein had built his own empire of influence. He maintained warm relationships with dozens of judges, assistant district attorneys, and high-ranking police officials, all of whom found their way onto his payroll one way or another. If someone was arrested, Rothstein could arrange for the case to disappear. If a venue was threatened with padlock laws for serving alcohol, he could provide legal protection or have the law itself rewritten. In the Garment District, Rothstein held court as the silent partner in the most powerful labour racketeering syndicate in the country. He used union muscle to extort factory owners and used factory muscle to break union strikes, playing both sides with effortless precision. He controlled the trucking routes, the freight elevators, the garment cutters, and the needle trades. With every dress, suit, and coat that left a Manhattan sweatshop, a sliver of the profit found its way to Rothstein's pocket. And then there was the money itself, mountains of it. In the gambling dens, in the speakeasies, in the betting parlours and racetracks and boxing rings and dogfights, cash moved in obscene quantities. Rothstein's revenue didn't flow, it gushed. His accountants handled millions every year, and his generosity, when it served his interests, became legendary. He bankrolled theatre productions, loaned money to producers and playwrights, and handed out lavish bonuses to his men. Everyone under him knew that they were working for the most powerful man in the city, and they were paid accordingly. Rothstein expected loyalty and intelligence, and in return, he made his underlings rich beyond their wildest expectations. But what truly elevated Rothstein above the rest was his ability to blend into the world of high society. He dressed like a Wall Street executive, dined at the finest clubs, and carried himself not like a thug, but like a gentleman of finance. His name was whispered in both political private clubs and run-down pool halls, and in each place, it carried the same weight. Some feared him, others admired him, everyone respected him. In a city obsessed with appearances, Rothstein understood that the ultimate power wasn't in brute force or criminal enterprise, it was in being untouchable. By 1926, Arnold Rothstein had amassed such immense wealth and power that he had no equal in the criminal world. He wasn't a kingpin, he was a king. Not in the back rooms of bars or in the alleys of Hell's Kitchen, but in the penthouses, the racetracks, the Broadway theatres, and the private members clubs where the real power resided. His network was vast, his fortune immense, and his influence immeasurable. He had built a new kind of criminal empire, one where money and respectability concealed a foundation of vice, manipulation, and local control. But perhaps his greatest legacy wasn't just what he controlled, but what he had created. Rothstein didn't merely operate within organised crime. He had organised it. He turned street gangs into syndicates, gamblers into businessmen, and thugs into lieutenants. The men who would go on to rule the American underworld: Luciano, Lansky, Bugsy, Dutch, Legs. They didn't just work for Rothstein, they were moulded by him. He was the man who had built the mob. But no one man can stay on top forever. As 1927 began, the empire Arnold Rothstein had spent a decade building began to strain under its own weight. Prohibition, once a golden opportunity, had grown too large, too violent, and too unpredictable to control. It had started as a calculated racket, a clean flow of scotch and rye smuggled from Europe, but it had turned into a daily bloodbath. Gunfire echoed across the boroughs. Hijackings, double crosses, and executions became routine. The profits were still vast, but so were the risks, and Rothstein was not built for chaos. He was no stranger to violence. He'd shot 3 policemen a decade ago, but he wasn't a street boss. He couldn't enforce control over a bootlegging war that had taken on a life of its own. His protégés, once loyal, were now acting independently. Dutch Schultz and Legs Diamond, both men he had mentored and enriched, had turned rogue. Schultz declared war on Diamond, and the city became their battlefield. Bodies piled up in doorways and alleyways, they were victims of ambushes, betrayals, and drunken vendettas. It was an empire gone feral, and Rothstein wanted out. He passed the liquor operations to the next generation, Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, but he wasn't retreating, he was repositioning. In Europe, Rothstein had long cultivated discreet relationships with pharmaceutical manufacturers like Merck and Bayer. Now, he used those connections to shift his empire into a new, more discreet, and even more profitable commodity, drugs. Unlike liquor, which had social legitimacy, heroin was taboo. It carried the stink of desperation and addiction, not glamour. But that same stigma made the trade far easier to control. Smaller, concentrated shipments brought higher returns and fewer prying eyes. Rothstein began importing morphine and heroin directly from Europe and opened quiet, carefully run dens throughout New York City. He was no longer a bootlegger, he had become the country's largest drug trafficker. But heroin was not alcohol, and it wasn't fashionable. The high society figures who once toasted him at the Cotton Club now kept their distance. The theatre producers and Broadway stars who had once relied on his loans began to cut ties. Rothstein, for the first time, found his circle narrowing. His name was still spoken in fear, but less and less in respect. And then came the communists. While his gangsters cracked skulls in the streets, Rothstein was playing a deeper game. With Moscow trying to infiltrate America's labor unions, the Communist Party realized they needed muscle. And when they needed muscle, they came to Rothstein. He provided men. When they needed money, their lawyers sent them to the only man they knew could bankroll revolution and charge 25% interest without blinking. Rothstein lent the party a staggering $1.7 million. He also promised protection not from thugs, but from the legal system. Judges, police officers, district attorneys, all were in his pocket, and Rothstein assured the communists that their operations would run undisturbed. They promised to pay him back $2.5 million in 12 months as a result of his protection. But he didn't stop at cash and muscle. Always the tactician, Rothstein recognized the rising popularity of arbitration in business disputes. It was civil, clean, and, if handled correctly, incredibly lucrative. So, when a group of lawyers formed the Arbitration Society of America, Rothstein offered them free office space at 45 West 57th Street and then sent them a $500 check for his own membership. He jokingly proposed naming the building the Hall of Justice. Arnold Rothstein, the king of the bootleggers, race fixers, and gambling dens, had now positioned himself as a champion of peaceful negotiations. But the irony was no joke. Rothstein controlled both sides of every dispute. He had the communists and the capitalists, the unions and the factory workers, the gangsters and the judges. He was funding both the fires and the firemen. Yet even Rothstein couldn't stop the tides that were quietly rising. Back in the garment industry, trouble was brewing. Jacob Little Augie Organ, still overseeing the labour rackets for Rothstein, had begun to drift. He had aligned himself with Legs Diamond, who had recently broken from Rothstein's control and was now muscling into bootlegging operations through Broadway's nightclubs and speakeasies. Rothstein, wary of the increased visibility, urged Organ to pivot. He told him to forget bootlegging and continue infiltrating the unions as they had done for the previous 8 years. That was where the future lay. But Organ couldn't adapt and was losing grip on the unions. His head turned from the fast money of Prohibition and Legs Diamond in his ear. In the summer of 1926, the cloak and suit workers went on strike. Factory owners, desperate to break the picket lines, hired Legs Diamond. The union leaders, backed by Rothstein's loans, hired Organ. On the surface, it was a turf war between rival gangsters. In reality, it was Rothstein pulling the strings on both ends, playing the factory bosses against the unions to extract more power and more money. The strike dragged on for nearly 7 months. Exhausted and broke, the union leaders turned in desperation to Rothstein's father, Abraham. A respected figure in his own right, Abraham told them the truth. They'd been appealing to the wrong Rothstein. If they wanted peace, they had to go to Arnold. And so they did. Rothstein summoned Diamond and Organ and instructed both to stand down. The strike ended. The workers won almost nothing. The union lost $3.5 million, much of it funneled into the pockets of middlemen and Rothstein. It was a farce, and it worked beautifully. Rothstein had orchestrated chaos and then been paid to clean it up. But he knew something had changed. The old methods, renting muscle, threatening strikes, enforcing control through fear, were becoming obsolete. The real money, the sustainable power, was in control from within. It wasn't just about breaking the unions, it was about owning them. Despite Rothstein's advice, little Augie still couldn't grasp that, but 2 of his lieutenants could, Lepke Buchalter and Garage Shapiro. Cold, calculating and ruthlessly efficient, Lepke, like Rothstein, understood that the future of organised crime lay not in chaos, but in structure. He and Garage began consolidating power and plotting against their boss, Little Augie, and eventually the conflict between old and new came to a head. On the evening of October the 15th, 1927, as Little Augie and Legs Diamond strolled down Delancey Street, a car pulled up beside them. From inside, Lepke, Garage and Curly Holtz opened fire. Augie took 12 bullets, 1 through the skull, and he was dead before he hit the pavement. Diamond survived, wounded in the leg and arm, and when questioned, he simply muttered, "Don't ask me nothing." He recovered, but bowed out of the garment industry for good. Rothstein's old guard was dead, and the new generation, colder, hungrier, and less loyal, had arrived. And Arnold Rothstein had lost another racket. But the greatest threat to Arnold Rothstein didn't come from bullets or betrayals, it came from within. Once a master of calculation and restraint, Rothstein's gambling, the very thing that had built his empire, had slipped out of his control. What was once strategic became compulsive, and he started losing thousands at the poker tables, racking up bets he refused to pay. Friends turned into enemies, allies distanced themselves. For a man who had always lived by the rules of respect and reputation, his new behaviour was catastrophic. People didn't want to associate with a degenerate gambler, not in high society and not in the underworld either. At the racetrack, his bets became impulsive and erratic. In 1926, he lost $300,000 on a single horse at Belmont, a British runner named Snob II. That same year, he dropped another $120,000 backing Harry Sinclair's prized horse, Morvich. Newspapers reported that Rothstein took the loss without batting an eye, but those who knew him understood the truth. He wasn't just losing money, he was losing control. In 1927, the bleeding got worse. Rothstein lost $850,000, the equivalent of over $15 million today, on one race at the Aqueduct racetrack in Queens. A stable on his payroll had guaranteed him a win. The other horses were fixed, but something went wrong. The horse lost, and the damage wasn't just financial. Police took notice of Rothstein's bet. The staggering sum that Arnold lost raised the attention of the police, and the stables, jockeys and trainers who once took orders from Rothstein suddenly began to distance themselves. He'd grown sloppy, placing massive bets under his own name instead of splitting them up across dozens of runners, as he once had. The whispers began. Rothstein wasn't sharp anymore, he was slipping, and Rothstein lost the racing racket. Even Saratoga, the jewel of his empire, began to sour on him. The town's high society, already uncomfortable with the rumours of drug rings and public gambling losses, wanted him gone. Rothstein had wrung every dollar from Saratoga. The races, the casinos, the nightclubs, it had all run its course. He quietly sold his stake in the Brook Club to his old partner, Nat Evans. For Rothstein, Saratoga was over. The horses were gone. The casinos were gone, and he'd been pushed out of the society that once tolerated his presence. His life was unravelling, the money was disappearing, his rackets were shrinking, and his name, once synonymous with power, had become a liability. And now, he was about to lose the only personal constant he had left. During these dark months, Rothstein had taken a mistress, Bobby Winthrop, a blonde Ziegfeld girl with wide blue eyes and a crooked smile. His wife, Carolyn, found out. She read it in the papers, and she was finished. One night, Rothstein returned to their Fifth Avenue home and, as usual, headed silently for his own bedroom. But this time, Carolyn stopped him. "Arnold," she said, "I've been waiting for you." He looked concerned. "Are you all right? Do you want me to call you a doctor?" "I want a divorce," she told him calmly. He blinked. "Why? What have I done? We can't live like this anymore, Arnold. You have more money than we'll ever need. Why not leave all this behind? Why not enjoy what we've built?" "It's too late," Rothstein said quietly. "I can't walk away. You know you're the only woman I've ever loved, but I'm in too deep. If I walk away now, everyone will think I'm a Welsher. They'll think that I've lost my nerve." Carolyn responded by telling him that she can't do it anymore. "Then do whatever makes you happy," he said. "I'll give you $25,000 a year unless you remarry. If you do, I'll give you 15. But if it doesn't work out, if he dies or you leave him, I'll make it 25 again. Just don't leave me completely." But she did. Carolyn Rothstein sailed to Britain and never looked back. Her not leaving him completely, once a possibility, was now off the table. Rothstein moved Bobby Winthrop into his home at 912 Fifth Avenue, but she too saw the truth quickly. The glamour was gone. His days and nights were consumed by poker tables, losing streaks, and frantic schemes to win it all back. The man who had once stood at the top of New York's underworld had become desperate and unpredictable. Feeling alone, cut off from her family and adrift in Rothstein's disintegrating world, Bobby spiraled. In 1927, she died by suicide. Rothstein had lost everything. His wife, his mistress, his casinos, his respect, his rackets, and his grip on the empire that he had once ruled with silent precision. He had always believed that he could control anything. The odds, the people, and the city. But now, for the first time in his life, he couldn't control himself. His brigade of killers had spread their wings and pursued their own criminal careers, and now he was truly alone. And the end for Rothstein was near. By the autumn of 1928, the man who had once ruled New York from the shadows was unravelling. The empire Arnold Rothstein had spent 2 decades building was crumbling, piece by piece, racket by racket, relationship by relationship. He had once been known for his control over men, over money, over outcomes, but now even Rothstein couldn't fix what was coming. His gambling, once measured and methodical, had become compulsive and chaotic. He no longer bet with the precision that had made him a legend, but with the desperation of a man chasing his own losses. In September, he entered a high-stakes poker and craps game hosted by George "Hump" McManus, a small-time gambler with a temper. The game stretched from Saturday night through Monday morning, with Rothstein losing over $300,000, a staggering sum. even by his standards. But worse than the loss was how he responded. Instead of settling up, Rothstein accused the table of cheating and stormed out without paying. It wasn't just a breach of etiquette, it was unthinkable. Arnold Rothstein welshing on a bet. That rumour spread like wildfire, and in the criminal underworld, that rumour was a death sentence. Rothstein, ever the tactician, didn't seem concerned. If they killed him, he reasoned, they'd never see the money, but he underestimated just how much resentment he'd built up and how little protection he had left. On the evening of November the 4th, McManus phoned Rothstein's at Lindy's Deli, his usual haunt. They arranged to meet privately at the Park Central Hotel to discuss the money. Rothstein, ever confident, handed his pistol to Nat Evans before heading out. He entered room 349, alone and unarmed. Sometime after 10:30 p.m, a single shot rang out. A .38 caliber bullet tore through Rothstein's abdomen, rupturing his bladder and damaging his intestines. Somehow, mortally wounded, he managed to stagger down the corridor and descend 2 flights of stairs to the street. There, he flagged down a police officer and asked to be taken not just to any hospital, but to the polyclinic, and only under the care of his personal doctor. He also requested his lawyer and instructed him to bring his will. The scene inside the hotel began to unravel quickly. A discarded revolver was found on the sidewalk outside, its grip scuffed and the barrel still warm. 1 shot had been fired. The remaining rounds were scattered around it, left behind in the confusion. The weapon had been wiped clean, likely by accident, by a taxi driver who found it first. The crime scene itself was chaotic, and the evidence, from the start, was compromised. At the hospital, Rothstein refused to name his killer. When Detective Patrick Flood asked who had done it, Arnold simply said, "My mother did it, Paddy." Even now, at the end, he played his cards close. News of the shooting spread fast. Friends, reporters, enemies and curious onlookers crowded into the hospital's waiting area. Rothstein's estranged wife Carolyn, back in New York, was rushed to the scene by his former bodyguard, Abe Attell. His brother Harry and father Abraham soon arrived, 2 men with whom he'd shared little in recent years, now standing silently at his deathbed. At 3:50 a.m, his lawyer Maurice Cantor returned to the room with a newly drafted will. Rothstein, unable to lift the pen, was guided into signing with a feeble X. The contents of the will shocked nearly everyone. Generous payouts to longtime associates, a sizable sum to his loyal bodyguard Abe Attell, and a huge amount to another former mistress, Anise Norton. Carolyn was granted income from a trust, but not the inheritance that she expected. After her death, the bulk of Rothstein's fortune would go to charity. It was a final assertion of control, a last hand played in a game he was rapidly losing. At 10:50 a.m. on November the 5th, 1928, Arnold Rothstein died. His death certificate blandly listed him as a real estate man living at 912 5th Avenue, but the truth was far more complicated. In life, Rothstein had been a kingmaker, a corrupter of men, and a master of odds. In death, he became a mystery. His funeral, held at Union Field Cemetery in Queens, was a modest affair, especially for a man who had once thrown $500,000 across a poker table without blinking. Only 200 mourners gathered. The coffin was extravagant, a bronze and mahogany monument to his ego, costing $25,000. But the silence that followed was deafening. No eulogies, no public displays of grief, just whispered speculation about who pulled the trigger. The investigation into his murder quickly turned into a farce. The Park Central Hotel was crawling with police, but the crime scene was tainted from the start. Fingerprints were smudged, evidence was mishandled, witnesses were unreliable or outright protected. The obvious suspect was George McManus. His coat was found in the hotel room. He had motive. $300,000 in gambling debts he couldn't recoup from Rothstein, but McManus insisted he was innocent. He said the meeting was simply to talk things over. Rumours swirled for years. Some said McManus had shot him in a drunken rage. Others believed Legs Diamond, now out from under Rothstein's influence, had taken revenge, suspecting Rothstein had ordered the murder of little Augie. One story had a remorseful McManus drunkenly confessing to a magician named Alflosso. Another tale came from Titanic Thompson, the legendary gambler. He said McManus had begged Rothstein to pay up, only to be humiliated and enraged when Rothstein refused. A struggle broke out, the gun went off, and whether it was planned or accidental hardly mattered. Rothstein was dead, and the city's most powerful fixer had become one thing he could never control: a victim. There were others in that hotel room, including McManus's brothers, one a former detective and another who was still active in the NYPD, and their presence all but guaranteed the case would be smothered under a blanket of corruption. The district attorney refused to press hard. The police conveniently lost evidence. A trial was held, but it was a charade. McManus was acquitted, the gun was never definitively tied to anyone, and the killing of Arnold Rothstein, like so much of his life, would remain a mystery wrapped in silence. In the end, Rothstein wasn't undone by rival gangs or a grand conspiracy. He was brought down by ego, addiction, and the very chaos he once manipulated so masterfully. His protégés, Lansky, Luciano, Costello, would go on to build empires of their own, forged from the blueprint that Rothstein left behind. But they learned from his mistakes. They stayed out of the spotlight. They built syndicates, not headlines. Rothstein, for all his genius, couldn't help himself. He needed to win, and he needed to be seen winning.
And when he finally lost, there was no one left to protect him. The man who had built the mob had crumbled under his own empire, and Arnold Rothstein's story ended in room 349 of the Park Central Hotel, but his legacy in how he organised crime will live on forever. Thanks so much for watching, I really do appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed the story of Arnold Rothstein. It was a fascinating one for sure. If you did, then please do like the video and consider becoming a subscriber, and I shall see you in the next one.